Is it something that we can afford? It's all good and well for everyone to say we need VAR in South African football. What is the cost? Is it something we can carry?
Well, the cost of VAR, we don't have an actual figure for South Africa because it hasn't been published yet. But from our research, looking at global figures, it costs somewhere in the region of between 2.8 to about 3 million rand per stadium to install VAR. And then it costs somewhere in the region of about 300,000 rand per game just to have VAR. Because remember, VAR is a technology that's licensed from Hawkeye Technology Innovations. That technology tracks the movement of the ball, and it uses about 16 cameras in a stadium, which are high-speed cameras, slow-mo cameras, and so on, to track the movement of a ball. And then on top of that, there's about 4 or 5 officials that sit in a booth that specifically look at games, and that's why there is that cost involved.
And if you're looking at a South African football league, like the one that we have, 16 teams that play in different venues, 240 games in an average season, and you're mentioning the cost of just a single game then, what would that equate to? We're looking at billions potentially? Well,
it's about 80 million rand a year. So it's quite an astronomical cost just in terms of taking that on. If you look at the PSL's revenue book, PSL's revenue, I think in the past 3 seasons has sat at somewhere around 1 billion rand. But of that, almost 90% of it goes back into the system through grants and administrative costs and so on and so on. There isn't enough runway in the PSL's book to take care of that cost. And then if you look at SAFA's book, it's a similar situation. I mean, SAFA's budget for referees in 2022 was only about 2 million rand. And they manage referees in the country. So there isn't enough on both sides to take care of the cost, perhaps putting the money together amongst themselves, and perhaps an outside partner would be needed to fund the implementation and management of VAR.
Yeah, and I want to get into the various parties and perhaps who will foot the bill in a moment, but I want to take us back to a case study that we do have on the continent, because it won't be the first implementation of VAR, should we get to that point. It did happen in Nigeria. Some lessons to be learned there, and perhaps the real cost of it did become clear to the Nigerian Football Federation. Take us through perhaps the observations in that regard.
Yeah, the Nigerian Football Federation implemented VAR not as a league-wide endeavor. It was specific to a match.
Yeah.
And it's easy to implement it specific to a match, especially a big match where you've got lots of broadcasters like your SuperSport, etc., who would come in and provide the infrastructure on a once-off basis. But then implementing it across the league, where, as you said, you have different teams with different, who a lot of them may not own stadiums. In Africa, a lot of teams don't own stadiums. Municipalities own those stadiums, and those stadiums are different. They're built in different times, and so on and so on. They don't have the infrastructure available to accommodate VAR. It's a problem to implement it across a league, and this is I mean, I can tell you that the last week's MTN 8 final had the potential of having VAR available because it's easy to implement it in one game.
Yeah.
But over a course of a season, it's a different ball game altogether, and the costs are just too high for people. In Africa at the moment, there's only 2 leagues that have VAR across the league. That's in Morocco, and that's Zambia is the second one. So it's very difficult to implement across the league. And even in some European countries, they don't have VAR. So yeah, it's a nice to have system, but it's very difficult to implement. And there's a big caveat in the fact that VAR doesn't fix refereeing. It doesn't, eradicate all the problems overnight. You still have a problem going forward with implementation, with the interpretation of the rules, because ultimately the human still needs to make the decision at the end of the day.
And that's precisely the question I wanted to ask. Is this the solution fit for the problem that's identified? Because generally in South African football, the problem is the poor quality of refereeing decisions. It still comes down to human intervention to some extent, though, because the VAR will still need a referee to interpret what they see, that the technology pulling through.
Yeah, absolutely. In a situation where you had clear lines around whether the ball crossed the line or not, such as goal line technology, yes, absolutely implement it. But ultimately, a refereeing decision still comes down to a subjective choice that is made by an individual. And what VAR does is that it highlights the fact that there's been an incident, you have to make a decision. And we've seen, because we have amateur referees in South Africa, none of our referees are professional referees. You have a situation where lots of decisions go badly because those referees are not full-time. That's not their job. They do it on an almost part-time basis. And you have to, in my view, elevate the standard of refereeing first, get refereeing to a standard where even if they didn't have VAR, you had full confidence that they would make the right decisions, and then bring in a system that helps them to make those decisions even faster, or to notice those incidents whenever they happen and then make those decisions.
All right, so then the problem would be, or the solution rather, would be to perhaps upskill the referees first and then implement VAR. The other question then many would have is around the perception from the referees. If there isn't enough money, as you mentioned, the SAFA budget sitting at, I think you said 200 million a year for the referees, there isn't enough money to pay the referees who are amateur referees and have to have other jobs to supplement the income. Would that not send an incorrect message perhaps to say there's money for VAR, but we don't have sufficient funds to pay you?
Yeah, that's a definite issue. It's about 2 million rand annually for referees at the moment. It could have gone up in the last financial year. But yes, I mean, if there is money to pay for VAR, why is there no money to pay for referees to be fully professional? And you're relying on those very same referees to use this VAR system. You know, so my view, and I expressed this opinion last year when we put out our first report on this VAR issue, is that firstly, increase the standard of refereeing, then further down the line, when you can afford the system, bring it in. I understand the minister's call. I understand that some decisions are problematic, but we have even bigger problems at the bottom level, at basic level, to deal with first.
And as we conclude then, you mentioned the minister. There are various parties involved here. There's the PSL, there's sponsors potentially, the broadcaster, the department as well. Who foots the bill then for VAR? Should then this be something that goes ahead? Yeah,
that's problematic. SAFA runs referees in the country. The PSL is a league in which those referees work. And then on top of that, there's all the broadcasters whose cameras would be needed to broadcast and provide the technology for the technology to work. And then there's the rest, which is the sports department, et cetera, et cetera. Somewhere along the line, we need to find a broad consensus on where the money is going to come from. Because at the moment, it's not coming from SAFA, it's not coming from the PSL, it's not coming from the broadcasters. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But perhaps the minister would oblige us with an answer with regards to that one.
Well, it does seem like it's still a long road ahead then to getting those answers for VAR technology implementation. But that's where we leave the conversation for this morning. That, of course, being Ndlovu.